what you want them to communicate. Just again, for some of you who may be joining for the first time, just a little bit of background on me. This is my Instagram. I encourage you guys, obviously, to follow me and DM me with any questions that you might have, either during or after. There's also obviously the chat function here inside Zoom. So after I present, we'll go into a bit of a Q&A phase where you'll be able to ask questions via the Q&A or via the chat function here in Zoom. But if we get off of the broadcast, or I don't have time to address your particular question, or I miss it, feel free afterwards to just shoot me a DM. I like meeting new people. I like making new friends. So totally happy to talk to you in that context as well. My background is in editorial. I was a fashion editor for W Magazine and Women's Wear Daily, way back in the day when those had the same editorial staff. So I'm kind of aging myself a bit, but really kind of developed my aesthetic and my kind of content tastes then when I was at Condé Nast. After that, I owned a creative agency for about 5 years and did some really fun projects with a business partner of mine who eventually bought me out. And then I went to work at Havas as a VP of Creative in North America for Havas Sports and Entertainment. And then from there, I went on to join the creative shop at Facebook, where I'm the creative lead on luxury fashion advertising. So I've done quite a few different things, from agency side to platform side to editorial to storytelling to organic to paid. And I love having these types of conversations. So like I said, feel free to tap into me for any of the questions that you have via any of those methods that we mentioned. What I introduced on Tuesday, I keep wanting to say last week, but it was actually just 2 days ago. What I introduced on Tuesday was the idea that there's really this kind of a two-step or a two-part process to doing the basic groundwork of kind of analyzing your visual identity. And it turns out actually that this two-step process is actually the same for your tone of voice. I mean, because what you're really doing is diving into who you are as a brand. And for some of you that's going to mean a larger company that has a tone of voice that is detached from you personally. And for some of the people on the line, you may be thinking about the brand as your personal brand. Either way, it's the same. You want to first think about how you're going to construct your tone of voice. What is the research that you need to do, or the deep dive thinking you need to do to pull the pieces together that are going to identify your tone of voice? But then obviously the second part of that is communicating with your tone of voice, because your tone of voice doesn't exist unless people are hearing it. You know, that old adage, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there, does it make a sound? Well, in the case of things like your tone of voice, no, it doesn't. If you develop a tone of voice and don't ever speak with it, it doesn't exist. So these two things are both really important: the way you construct your tone of voice, as well as the way you communicate your tone of voice out there in the digital wild, if that makes sense. So starting with constructing tone of voice, again, this is quite similar to what you might do while you're exploring your visual identity. Constructing your tone of voice has a lot of different pieces to it, but the three main things that you're going to be concerned with, the kind of macro topics that you're going to be concerned with, are going to be what matters to you, what's important to you, who are you trying to reach with your communications, and then lastly, what matters to those people, because what your responsibility is to build almost a Venn diagram where, you know, you have those two circles that overlap in the middle, and that overlap is going to be your sweet spot between what matters to you and what matters to the people you're trying to talk to. That's where your tone of voice, very similar to your visual identity, that's where your tone of voice needs to live. But there is a really interesting way that I want to share with you guys to kind of, after you've done that research, start to use the result of that exploration. So now this kind of metrics or kind of graph that I'm going to show you isn't meant to help you answer those questions. I believe that's going to be a separate process, and everyone is going to have a different way of answering those three questions. Some people are going to be involved in larger teams where you have a strategist that can work with you. Other people are going to be working really by themselves and doing probably a little bit more anecdotal or organic exploration of the communities around them and the people that they're working with. And maybe even doing a little bit of testing and learning, putting content out there, seeing how people react until you can answer clearly what matters to you, who do you want to reach, and what matters to them. But once you have the answers to those questions and you feel quite confident that the answers are correct for you, building your tone of voice might look something like this. You may want to start off by building a matrix that says my voice or our voice is, and our voice is not. And your way you fill this out might look something like this. This really is actually what, as a creative director, when I receive creative briefs from brands that I'm considering working with, a lot of times these tone of voice matrices will look very similar to this. They'll say, my voice is entertaining, it's not boring. My voice is inclusive, it's not snobby. It's unique, not basic, or it's helpful, not useless. And the first thing I do is immediately, if I get a matrix that looks like this, the first thing I do is call whoever the creative lead is and schedule a coffee or a phone chat or something, because as useful as this sounds, it's actually absolutely, completely useless. The issue with this particular matrix is all of these words on the right. They're all opposites of the words on the left. So, you're not really adding any information or building any clarity on your tone of voice if you design a matrix like this. If you say that you are going to be entertaining, we would assume that you're not going to be boring. So you don't need to state that. That's quite obvious. Same thing with being inclusive. Like, we would assume that that's not going to be snobbery. And same with the other things. So what you want to do is really interrogate this not list, what you are and what you are not. And ideally, the litmus test that I always ask the creators to use is, if the lists can't be swapped and still make sense for some other brand, then you haven't really done your homework and you're not really clarifying your perspective or your POV. And when I say that, what I mean is, like, you can imagine if we swapped these, that would imply that some brand out there is literally saying their tone of voice is boring, it is snobby, it is basic, and it is useless. That would never happen. No one would purposefully position their brand that way. So this is not a particularly useful list of is nots. A useful list of is nots might look something like this. If you were to say that your tone of voice is entertaining, you might clarify further to say it's not theatrical. Because what you're saying there is, we want to entertain people and we want to keep them engaged and we want them to really enjoy the content that we're putting in front of them. But we're not about being over the top or bells and whistles and colors and streamers and blah, blah, blah. Like, that's maybe not who we are. We're going to be entertaining, but we're going to be entertaining in our way. And that way is not theatrical. That's a layer of clarity that helps people understand what your tone of voice is, whether you're talking about bringing in a collaborator, bringing in an influencer, whoever it may be. When that person sees that distinction, they know more about what you mean by being entertaining. If your tone of voice is inclusive, it may not be universal, for example. So if you're inclusive but not universal, what that would imply is, yes, we want to be kind of a big tent and we want to welcome in lots of people. We're not going to turn anyone away at the door. We're not going to be snobs about it. But at the same time, we are meaning to address a specific topic or meaning to talk to a specific community. And therefore, this isn't something that is meant for everybody. We're not talking in order to talk to everyone. There are going to be some people for whom this isn't going to resonate, and that's going to be fine with us. This is not a universal conversation. But that being said, anyone who does want to engage with us is more than welcome. So again, you've added a layer of clarity by saying that you are inclusive, but you're not universal. Same thing with unique. You can be unique without being quirky. You can stand out as an individual without being necessarily strange or bucking trends or challenging the status quo. So again, a layer of clarity. And same thing with being helpful. You can be helpful without being instructional. Perhaps your brand is positioned to provide more advice and guidance in a lifestyle context, but you as a personal creator or as a brand don't particularly want to dive into how-tos and things that are step-by-step guides. And so you layer in that clarity that we are helpful, but we're not here to be instructional. And so that becomes a lot more responsible of my tone of voice is and my tone of voice is not. And you can see now where that litmus test comes in. If you were to switch these things around, they could make sense for another brand. There may be another brand out there that says, we are theatrical, we're not just entertaining. We specifically are about turning the volume up as high as it can get, and it's about wow factor. We are universal, we're not just inclusive. We really want to be talking to everybody. Everything we say applies to any person on earth. It applies to all of humanity. So we're taking exclusive to the nth degree. The brand might say we are quirky. We're not just unique. We're here to really turn things upside down and make you think differently about the conversations that you're having or about the visuals that you see. And lastly, that brand might say, we're here to be instructional, not just helpful. We're not going to give you broad guidance. We are literally going to walk you through the steps for improving whatever situation it is we're talking about. So if you can swap those two things around, and it seems like something that another brand might say, you're probably on the right track to establishing a good matrix for your tone of voice. Now, these things often can be quite long. If you're working with a larger company and doing any sort of executive exercises to hone in on what what this matrix might look like, you may actually start with a list that has 50 things on it, 50 different pairs of words on it that ultimately get called down to say a top 10 or a top 5 or something like that. So this exercise in building this matrix can be, while it's quite simple here, it can actually be quite an in-depth, long process that requires a lot of research and a lot of thinking and an internal examination for your organization or for yourself, depending on which you're building the tone of voice for. So I hope that kind of gives you a little bit of clarity into where to start building the tone of voice. But obviously, you're going to want to communicate with your voice. And the way I have structured this section is kind of in response to some of the questions that we received on Tuesday. We talked a lot about the tools of building a visual identity and talked a lot about the type of exploration and what the information you might pull during exploration might lead to. And a lot of the questions were a little bit more about content strategy and a little bit more about how you actually get that content in front of people or get that visual identity in front of people. So I wanted to, on the tail end of this conversation about tone of voice, talk about how your tone of voice comes to life. More so in content strategy than in, for instance, tactics like the type of nouns you might use, the way you might talk about yourself, that sort of thing. So obviously, when you're talking about communicating on your owned channels, you primarily are talking about two types of content. You have your paid media that you're putting paid distribution behind toward a specific target audience with a specific strategic goal. And then you have your organic media, which is a little bit more at the whims of the digital platforms algorithms. And you're kind of putting it out there in much more of an editorial vibe with editorial metrics like gaining an audience, getting new followers and engagement and things like that. With paid media, what your tone of voice should be designed to do is actually be able to be activated across 3 different kinds of conversations that you might have. So if you're talking about paid advertising, and again, I'm thinking that you've done the pre-work, you maybe have a matrix, and you're thinking quite deeply about what your tone of voice is and how you want to show up. The next thing you're going to do is say, okay, if I'm going to be doing some sort of paid advertising or promoted posts, I've got to think strategically about whether or not I can stick to this tone of voice while achieving my goals of awareness, which obviously is at the top of kind of the consumer funnel. Awareness is where you're basically telling people, hey, I exist, or hey, my product exists, or hey, my service exists. As you then move down into consideration, you're really trying to convince people about the value that your product or your service adds, because they're then going to be considering it against some of your competitors, but also just thinking about, again, in crisis times where purse strings might be a bit tighter for companies if you're a B2B business, or for consumers if you are a B2C business. People are going to be considering whether or not they need your service at all against all of the things that they have to purchase and spend their money on, not just on your direct consumers. So can the tone of voice that you've established based on the initial research, answering those three questions and building out your matrix, can the tone of voice that you've settled on be used to sway people toward engaging with you or purchasing your product in paid advertising? And lastly is conversion. And conversion is the simplest one, because that's literally where people are hitting the buy button or signing up for the class, or registering to attend the session that you have. It's really important that your tone of voice is designed to be able to live at all three of these levels, not just to be super, super promotional and salesy, and not to be super, super high awareness and just kind of like, look at me, without driving your actual business goals. And when you look at organic content, there's actually a couple of different ways to think about organic content. One of the most prevalent ways, especially for DTC brands that we see, is to just do what we call collapsing the funnel. So that funnel of awareness, consideration, and conversion in a paid campaign can be kind of divided out into several different content touch points, because you can design an asset for awareness, and an asset for consideration, and an asset for conversion, and send those out in waves of paid distribution that become kind of a cadence for that paid campaign. And that's what we see mostly from larger brands. When they launch a campaign, they have these distinct phases of the campaign, and they send different assets out to us to do different things. Whereas with a DTC brand that might have a smaller budget and rely a lot more on organic conversation to drive their business results, they might take each individual asset and collapse that entire funnel into that asset. So the asset itself might do all three of these things. And that you would see like a brand like in their early days, Glossier was very much like this. You know, you would see some brands have a vast difference in the look of their organic content versus their paid content. Like one looks like a produced ad and the other looks like a social shot. And in the early days of Glossier, which was quite a testament to their success, it was very difficult to tell the difference between something that was a promotion for Glossier and something that was just an organic asset for Glossier. Because they took this approach and collapsed that funnel so that they were able to drive awareness, drive consideration, and drive conversion in a single asset. And their aesthetic really lent itself well to that. Obviously, with organic, there's another way to do it, and that is more dependent on an editorial calendar, where you might look at a span of time that you have to cover with organic content and decide that as a brand, you want your tone of voice to shift from one topic to the other based on what tentpole activities might be happening that your brand is participating in, or tentpole moments that your brand might have, like product launches or speaking series or offers. So you see these kind of larger lines on this graph here, and those are meant to kind of represent more the tentpole moments that a brand might have, as opposed to kind of more common evergreen, everyday conversations. And so your organic content might actually kind of oscillate between all of these different topics depending on what's going on. That first tentpole moment, it may be the first time you've ever done it, and it may be a big new association for you. Maybe it's the first time you're participating in the book. Maybe it's the first editorial that you've gotten in a big magazine or something like that. And so for that tentpole moment, you want to shift your organic voice into awareness, because you want to tell people about this big thing that just happened that's going to then help as you go into more of a consideration phase afterwards. But then last, you see the last big tentpole moment there is not labeled awareness, because you may be launching a new product. If it's happening close enough to a big awareness tentpole moment, maybe you don't need to repeat that awareness messaging again. Maybe you can kind of live off of that halo effect for a while and have this tentpole moment anchored by conversion content. So looking at your editorial calendar, looking at what's happening for your brand, whether you're an individual or a company, and deciding how that content needs to adjust and what that tone of voice needs to be, can be important if you're looking at this from an editorial calendar perspective. But obviously the most responsible way to do it, I think, is to think about these things together. Even if you're a small brand and doing very small paid campaigns, as opposed to kind of these larger, huge digital campaigns that the bigger brands are doing, thinking about what you can promote to a specific audience, which is what paid does for you, versus what you send out to your existing audience, which is what organic does for you, I think can be very important. So you might have this initial approach to your organic content with your tone of voice, kind of oscillating between its awareness state, its consideration state, and its conversion state. Or you may actually be the type of brand that decides you want to go the DTC Glossier route and have each one of those touch points be a collapsed funnel where the asset itself is designed to do all of the layers of the funnel and potentially drive all layers of the funnel. But once you've decided which one of those organic approaches you're going to go to, I think it behooves all brands to think about, how do I layer on top of that these targeted moments where I am going to do some sort of a paid initiative? Because the paid initiative reaches people who aren't already inside your circle. You can select a target audience of people who potentially aren't following you, who potentially aren't aware of your product or service, and use the paid distribution to reach out and actually increase the size of your organic audience. So thinking about how you layer that on top is super important, but also thinking about how that all ties together and how your tone of voice can actually power those conversations. And you can see now why, today the medium is the message. So you can probably see now why thinking about all of this at the same time, even though tactically you're probably going to want to explore, experiment, and research each one of them separately, knowing that you're going to be taking into consideration things like distribution at the tail end might affect some of the decisions that you decide to make when you're building that matrix, or when you're thinking about which audience you want to reach, or when you're thinking about what might be important to these people. Thinking about the full process and the end game can help you make smarter decisions at the beginning while you're trying to set up your tone of voice. So that is it for my presentation on kind of tone of voice and how you can use it in distribution. Again, just a reminder here, I'm going to go into the kind of Q&A session now. So go ahead and start chatting, sending in questions via chat here, or feel free to DM me on my Instagram if you want. So we will come out of here and I'll look to see what questions we have. And if I miss your question, or if you think of a question later, Instagram DM is the best way to go. But we'll definitely answer as many questions as I can while I'm here with you. Let's see, I've got one question in Q&A here. Are you using brand archetypes to create the tone of voice? Interesting. I go back and forth on using brand archetypes. I think that they can be limiting, especially in kind of the wild west of marketing. I think brand archetypes are a little bit more useful in kind of more traditional marketing spaces, out of home, for instance, things like that. I think that digital brands have to be a little bit more responsive than in my experience, what I've found archetypes allow people to be. But if, for instance, someone is kind of floundering and really aren't feeling like they are getting a grasp on what their tone of voice should be, potentially turning to brand archetypes could be a good place to start. I would just suggest editing really, really severely for your individual case. What do you think is the best way to start when you have yet to establish a tone? However, you have received clients from word of mouth and referrals. Yeah, I think that you can establish a tone at any point in time. I think what you're meaning there, if I'm interpreting it correctly, is establishing a a consistent tone that kind of doesn't change, kind of follows a strategy. I think you can establish a tone whenever you want. The difference when you've already got some kind of word of mouth and referrals, you already have a small community, is you just have more information than maybe someone who's starting fresh might have access to help you determine what that tone should be. So for instance, going back to those three questions, what matters to you, who do you want to talk to, and what matters to them. Your who do you want to talk to, you've got some concrete information there because you've already got some clients on the books, you've already got some conversations going. That means that you can look at who those people are and say like, okay, do I need to expand beyond this type of person or this type of transaction, or do I really want to double down on expanding and getting more people who already fit into what we would call a lookalike group for the clients that they already have. So I definitely don't think it's a problem if you don't have a consistent strategic tone of voice, but you already have clients. I actually think it's a bit of a benefit because that middle question, who do you want to talk to, you've already got a bit of a data point or some inputs on. Any other questions there? You guys are shy this time. Wow, those two were rapid fire, and then everyone's like, okay, I'm quiet now.
One thing I did want to say, just because we were working on it with one of our clients, is the kind of, and most clients who are dealing with direct to consumer will have an automated drip campaign already set up in their email service provider. And a lot of people just kind of have set those and forgotten about them, and they've created them months or even years ago in some cases. And we, realized, just because we subscribe to a lot of our clients' emails, that the emails that were going out, because they were written pre-COVID, were just so out of touch with what's going on. And so it's just one of those things I will point out, that a lot of people just forget about them, but it is a really good idea to revisit all of your drip campaigns in your email provider. And these are your automated trigger emails, like your welcome email, your thank you email, a post-purchase email, even just doing an audit of images of the language. Like one of the clients that we were working with had an image of someone on an airplane, like using a face mask. And so like nobody's flying now, it is a little off in terms of connecting with your community now. So that is just an area that I think a lot of people forget about, because they're thinking about, oh, like, what should we be putting on social now? What should we be putting in our ads if we're doing ads? And email, you're thinking about like what's going to go out in terms of your content calendar emails, but you're not really thinking about the things that were created that are just automated. So definitely do an audit of that for sure, because we've really seen some issues. And then if you can, like another brand that we're working with who creates these mini capsule vials that are made of ocean-bound plastic. It's a company called Cadence, and they make these portable containers for any sort of product, from pills to shampoo that you can use when you're going to the gym to a sleepover. And so obviously nobody's leaving their houses now, so that's not really a concern, but they're reshooting a lot of them to put hand sanitizer in it, because obviously that is something that people want to carry in their pocket right now. So that, obviously just as you're sort of thinking about the tone of voice of your brand and how you want to be communicating with your customers, I think just really trying to think out of the box and use some of the things that Court was saying in terms of thinking about what your customer needs right now and what they need from you, and how can you even change your offering to meet what their needs are. And Court, I think another question just came in actually.
Yes, I see one there. I just want to build on to exactly what you were just saying, Jess. I think it's what you were just saying is super important. I think we need to double click on it. Is that your tone of voice doesn't have to be static. I think this will also kind of lead into the question that we have here. You can, I think as we were talking about that timeline and what those tentpole moments might be for your brand, some of those tentpole moments might be big enough that you actually need to go back to those three questions. What's important to me? who do I want to talk to and what's important to them. Something like a global pandemic definitely is a tentpole moment that's big enough that you may even want to go back and look at those 3 questions again. And I think that's where a lot of the thought that Jess was just communicating comes in. It's kind of like, okay, well, I may now need to talk to a different group of people because of this. I actually also may need to offer them something different because what they care about has changed. And you can leave it kind of in the context of the brand that you've established, but you definitely may have to, as you go along, make adjustments to what the tone is to make sure that you're staying relevant. Because relevancy marketing is the era that we're in right now, and at the end of the day, relevancy is what we're all chasing. The question that we have on here is going to market a good time to change tone? And do you have to be careful not to lose brand loyalty, or should you just run with the new tone? I think it depends on what we mean by change, right? I think going into a new market, it's definitely along the lines of what we were just talking about. That's one of those tentpole moments in your brand's evolution or on your editorial calendar that might mean you need to go back and look at those 3 questions again. That being said, you don't need to do something, when we say change your tone, we don't mean that you need to do something that feels like a betrayal of your original goals and objectives. Whatever your original positioning is as a brand still needs to shine through, and that needs to shine through consistently, whether you're expanding from the West Coast to the East Coast, or expanding from America into Europe, or expanding from Europe into Asia. Whatever the scale of the new market expansion is, you want to be able to plug all comms globally or regionally or nationally back into whatever your original brand positioning is, although the tone may need to change. I mean, we've all seen horrible missteps, especially in the fashion industry, as they've courted the new affluent consumer in Asia, trying to go into that market with specifically Western humor. When the tone that kind of humor has often doesn't resonate, and vice versa. So it definitely behooves you to go back to those 3 questions with a tentpole moment like this, and it is a good time to adjust your tone, change your tone, yes, but not change it so that your brand becomes unrecognizable, and that should protect a bit of that brand loyalty.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, thank you guys so much for coming, and thank you to Court for presenting. That was awesome. So in terms of Lunch and Learn, so we're taking a break next week, but we're launching a new series in May called the Just Enough 2 series, and it's just enough for you as a founder or you as a leader at your company to manage different aspects of it. So we're going to be diving into knowing just enough about Facebook and Instagram ads, just enough about email marketing, just enough about your company's financials. So we're not saying like you're going to leave the Lunch and Learn and all of a sudden you can manage all of the ads. The purpose of these is really to help you be able to work with vendors, assess their success rate, and ask the right questions when you're hiring new vendors. So yeah, so stay tuned for that. We'll be putting more information on that in the at the bottom of our homepage, and we'll have the full schedule up next week for that. And yeah, we love seeing you guys here on a weekly basis. It's been really awesome, and thank you so much to Court for the series.
Absolutely, Jess. My pleasure. And I will see you once the world reopens and we can have cocktails.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much.
I'll talk to you later. Bye, guys.
Bye, guys. Thank you.